The morning broke with a cold that Montana had never seen in its history. Tom Wilson sat in his warm living room, watching the frost cover the window of his small house on the edge of the forest. The thermometer outside the door read -40 degrees, and the howling wind made the valley tremble. It was a winter that froze everything, not only nature, but also the hearts of people. Tom was used to being alone. For years he had lived in this secluded cabin, surrounded by nothing but mountains, forests, and endless snowfields. The only regular visitors were the wild animals, moose, wolves, and occasionally a bear. But this morning everything changed. With his steaming mug of coffee in his hand, he glanced out the window. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. In front of him, in the snowstorm, the massive silhouette of a grizzly bear emerged. The animal stood upright, and its fur glittered with a layer of ice crystals. But it wasn't the size or the mere presence of the bear that shook Tom. It was its behavior. The bear, a powerful mother, was approaching the house, and behind her huddled three cubs, one of whom could barely stand. It kept collapsing in the deep snow, its tiny movements growing weaker and weaker. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Tom couldn't believe what he was seeing. The bear knocked with its enormous paw on the living room window, a rhythmic, almost human-like knocking that echoed through the house. Instinctively, Tom recoiled, his heartbeat quickening. Grizzlies were unpredictable, especially when in distress. But this mother showed no aggression. Her movements were purposeful, almost desperate. Again and again, she knocked on the window while the wind howled and the snowdrifts danced around her. Tom stepped closer to the window. The bear mother's eyes met his, and he felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. It was as if the animal was pleading with him, as if it knew that his help was the last hope. Suddenly, the smallest cub collapsed in the snow, its tiny body motionless. The mother let out a deep, mournful sound that went through bone and marrow. She carefully picked up the cub with her mouth and pressed it against the pane, as if she wanted to show Tom her despair. "What the hell?" he murmured, unable to take his eyes off the scene. The other two cubs huddled, shivering, against their mother, while the snowflakes fell mercilessly on them. The cold seemed to be sucking the last spark of life from their bodies. Tom knew that bears should be hibernating at this time of year. What had driven them out of their den? An avalanche? A predator? It was impossible to say, but one thing was clear. This family was at the end of its strength, and the mother was doing everything to save her cubs. His gaze wandered to the old shotgun hanging on the wall. Every survival instinct within him told him to lock the door and wait until the animals disappeared. But he couldn't erase the images. The huge paw knocking on the glass, the pleading eyes of the mother, the small cubs slowly freezing in the snow. The mother bear took a step back and raised both paws in the air. It was a gesture that took Tom's breath away. She seemed to be assuming a kind of prayer pose, her eyes fixed on him, and her expression was so human that it was impossible for him to regard her as just an animal. Her desperation pierced the frosty barrier of the window and reached him deep in his soul. Tom felt an internal conflict threatening to tear him apart. Should he intervene? Was it his responsibility to help these animals? The logical part of him warned him of the danger, but his heart, gripped by the mother's eyes, told him that he couldn't simply watch. Outside, the storm had intensified. Visibility was almost completely gone, and the bears became shadowy outlines struggling in the icy darkness. The smallest cub showed no signs of movement, and the mother bear began frantically pushing snow against the window, as if she were trying to write something. Tom knew he had to act. Never in his life had he felt such a connection to a wild animal. He reached for his thick winter jacket and took a deep breath. Whatever he did, it would change everything. He slowly opened the door. The icy air hit Tom's face as he opened the door a crack. The storm seemed to overwhelm all his senses, the howling of the wind, the stinging of the snow, and the biting cold that slowed every movement. But that faded when he saw the bear mother's eyes. She paused, her massive form motionless as a statue, and watched him intently. Behind her, the three cubs lay in the snow, one motionless, while the other two shivered weakly. Tom hesitated. His mind screamed at him to close the door immediately, but something within him held him back. It was more than pity. It was a connection, an unspoken understanding between him and the desperate mother. He felt the weight of her distress like a physical burden on his shoulders. Slowly, he stepped outside, his gaze fixed on the ground so as not to appear threatening. The mother bear did not retreat, but her eyes followed his every move. Carefully, he knelt beside the smallest cub, which was almost completely covered in snow. Its breath was barely perceptible, and the thin layer of ice crystals on its fur made it look like a frozen sculpture. "Okay, little one," Tom murmured, sliding his trembling hands under the cub. It was feather-light, far too light for a bear cub of that age. As he picked it up, he felt the cold cut through his gloves. The mother took a step forward, but her movements remained controlled. She continued to watch him with a mixture of hope and caution. "I'll take it inside," he said aloud, even though he knew the words had no meaning for her. But as if she understood him, the bear nodded almost imperceptibly. Tom stood up, the cub held firmly against his chest, and went back to the door. He could feel the mother's eyes following his every step. Inside, he carefully laid the cub on a blanket in front of the fireplace. The weak flickering of the fire was barely enough to drive out the cold of the room, but it was better than outside. He fetched a second blanket and wrapped the cub in it before he began gently rubbing its paws to restore circulation. A dull thud made him jump. He hurried back to the door and saw that the mother bear had come closer. Her two other cubs clung to her fur, their small bodies trembling uncontrollably. The mother raised a paw and pressed it against the glass, a gesture that seemed so human that Tom held his breath. "You all want in, don't you?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. The idea of letting a bear family into his house was absurd, but the thought of leaving them to die in the cold was unbearable. He made a decision that defied every survival instinct within him. Slowly, he opened the door wider and stepped back. The mother looked at him for a moment, as if to make sure he wasn't setting a trap. Then she carefully led her cubs over the threshold. She moved with incredible gentleness, her heavy paws leaving deep imprints in the snow as she nudged the two shivering cubs ahead of her. When the bear family finally entered the house, the scene that unfolded defied all expectations. The young cubs clung to their mother, their small paws carefully tapping on the wooden floor. Tom held his breath as the mother settled down beside the fire, her cubs pressed close to her body. He closed the door and leaned heavily against the wood, his heart pounding in his chest. He could barely believe what he had just done. A bear family was sitting in his living room, and instead of chaos, there was a strange calm. The mother began licking her cubs to warm them, and Tom felt the tension in his body slowly dissipate. He went to the kitchen and filled a shallow bowl with warm water. When he placed it in front of the mother, she raised her head and looked at him. Her eyes sparkled in the firelight, and for a moment, it seemed as if she was smiling gratefully. "You're going crazy, Tom," he muttered, but deep down, he knew that this was the beginning of something extraordinary. The warmth of the fireplace slowly began to drive out the cold from the small bodies of the bear cubs. The smallest cub, the one Tom had brought in first, stirred weakly under the blanket. Its breathing gradually became more regular. The mother bear watched each of its breaths while she continued to warm her other two cubs with her rough, warm breath. She seemed to be carefully planning her every move to protect her family as best she could. Tom stood a few steps away, trying to comprehend the surreal situation. A bear family in his living room. No one would have believed it, not even himself. But instead of causing chaos, the mother bear showed a level of control and respect that took his breath away. The cubs stayed close to her side without making a sound, and the mother kept her gaze fixed on Tom, as if to make sure he posed no threat. He had his doubts. What if the bear changed her mind? What if she panicked? Tom knew he would have no chance if she attacked him, but something about her behavior reassured him. She seemed determined but not aggressive, protective but not threatening. It was as if she understood that he was the only one who could help her. Tom went into the kitchen and searched his supplies. He found a few old blankets he no longer needed and carefully placed them next to the mother bear. She looked at him, her eyes sparkling in the firelight, and then she pulled the blankets closer with her powerful paws to bed her cubs on. It was a simple gesture, yet it had a profound effect on Tom. This bear was more than an animal. She was a mother fighting for her children, just as any human would. With a mixture of fascination and caution, Tom sat down on the couch. The mother bear continued to watch him, but visibly relaxed when she saw that he posed no threat. Her cubs, now a little warmer and calmer, snuggled close to her and began to snore softly. The scene before him was so peaceful that Tom momentarily forgot that these animals, in the wild, were usually unpredictable and dangerous. The night progressed, and the snowstorm outside became even more intense. Tom checked the thermometer. The temperature had dropped to minus 45 degrees. He knew that the bears would have had no chance of survival outside. The thought made him shudder. He was glad he had opened the door, even though it went against all reason. Suddenly, there was a movement in the corner of the room. Tom's cat, a shy gray tabby named Whiskers, cautiously peeked out from under the sofa. Her green eyes fixed on the bears, and Tom held his breath. What if the mother bear saw the cat as a threat? But the opposite happened. The bear slowly turned her head toward the cat, made a deep, reassuring sound, and then lowered her head into a position that clearly showed no aggression. Whiskers hesitated, then cautiously stepped closer. The cubs, who had become more alert again, watched the cat curiously. One of them took a small, wobbly step forward, only to be gently held back by its mother with a paw. It was as if she was teaching her cubs to respect the small animal. Tom was speechless. These animals were exhibiting behaviors he never thought possible. The mother bear demonstrated not only incredible intelligence, but also an awareness of the boundaries of her new environment. She kept her cubs from damaging Tom's furniture or belongings, and seemed to know exactly that she was a guest in his home. As dawn broke, the storm had finally subsided. The first rays of the sun shone through the frosted windows, illuminating the unusual scene. The mother bear lay curled up with her cubs on the blankets while Whiskers watched everything from a safe distance. Tom felt a strange peace. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't alone. But he knew that this couldn't last. The bears had to return to the wild as soon as it was safe. But how would he manage that? And would the mother bear understand when the time came? Questions swirled in his head as he leaned back and watched the peaceful scene. One thing was certain. His life would never be the same after this night. The days following the storm brought an unusual routine to Tom Wilson's house. The mother bear and her cubs, who were gradually recovering from their icy ordeal, had adapted to life in Tom's house in an astonishing way. Their movements remained cautious, almost respectful, as if they knew they were in a foreign world. Tom couldn't help but be impressed by the mother's behavior. She showed a discipline he had never thought possible in wild animals. The bear cubs, now much more active, strictly adhered to their mother's instructions. If one of them became too curious and started sniffing at a piece of furniture, she would make a deep, guttural sound that immediately made them retreat. Tom watched this scene from the kitchen table and could only shake his head. He had always thought that animals were purely instinctual creatures, but here, a level of intelligence was being displayed that amazed him. The mother bear treated his home with a care that was almost human. When one of the cubs accidentally knocked over a small container, she picked it up with her paw and placed it near the fireplace, where it was safe. The connection between Tom and the mother bear grew stronger day by day. No spoken word was necessary. Their communication was subtle yet clear. A look, a gesture, all that was enough to establish an understanding between them. The mother seemed to know that Tom only wanted to help, and Tom knew that these animals were more than simple creatures of the wild. A moment that particularly touched him was when the smallest cub, the one that had almost died upon their arrival, cautiously limped over to him. It looked at him with its dark, round eyes, full of curiosity and gratitude. Slowly, it placed a small paw on his knee, a sign of trust that deeply moved Tom. He remained still so as not to frighten the cub, and felt the bond that was forming between them. The bear family began to get used to small rituals. Tom provided them with water, and the mother made sure that the cubs drank first before taking a sip herself. They didn't eat any of Tom's supplies, but seemed only to seek the safety and warmth of his house. The mother took every opportunity to groom and warm her cubs while keeping a close eye on Tom's movements. Whiskers, the cat, had also integrated himself into the strange group. Initially, he had observed the bears from a safe distance, but gradually he dared to come closer. The mother bear showed no aggression whatsoever. Instead, she treated Whiskers with the same calm acceptance that she showed Tom. One of the cubs even ventured to play with the cat, leading to a brief chase around the fireplace that brought a laugh to Tom's face. Throughout it all, Tom kept wondering how this situation could continue. The storm was over, and the temperatures were slowly beginning to rise. It wouldn't be long before the bears had to return to the wild. But how would that happen? Would they simply leave, or would the mother bear give a sign that she was ready? In a quiet night, when the cubs were asleep and the fire in the fireplace crackled softly, Tom sat in an armchair and contemplated the scene before him. The mother bear lay curled up with her cubs, sleeping peacefully on the sofa. It was a peace he hadn't felt in years, but in this peace there was also a quiet sadness, a knowledge that this strange community would soon end. "You'll have to leave soon," he whispered, even though he knew the words had little meaning. But the mother bear raised her head and looked at him. Her eyes sparkled in the light of the fire, and for a brief moment, Tom thought she understood him. She held his gaze before slowly lowering it and resting her head back on her paws. The days passed, and the bears grew stronger. The cubs now played lively in the living room, but always stayed close to their mother. Tom began making preparations for their departure. He knew that he would never forget this extraordinary visit, but he was also sure that this was not the end of their story, but a beginning. The morning the bears left began with a quiet clarity rarely found after a harsh winter. The snow glittered under the first rays of the sun, and the forest all around lay in a sublime stillness. Tom woke up early and knew that today was the day. There was something in the air, an unspoken farewell that was inevitable. The mother bear was already awake. She sat near the fireplace, looking out through the window where the world was shrouded in pristine white. Her cubs lay huddled beside her, still deep in their dreams. Tom noticed that this time she wasn't watching him attentively as usual. Instead, she seemed thoughtful, almost as if she was preparing herself internally for something. He quietly went into the kitchen and prepared warm water and one last breakfast for his unusual guests. The mother bear accepted the bowl with a slow, grateful nod and let her cubs drink. It had become a ritual that Tom almost considered familial, and he couldn't imagine that this would be the last time. After the cubs had eaten, the mother bear began to wake them with gentle nudges. Her movements were calm but purposeful. She seemed determined, and Tom felt that she knew the time had come. The cubs yawned and stretched before pressing close to their mother. Tom stepped closer. He felt his throat tighten, and he fought back the rising emotions. "It's time, isn't it?" he said softly, more to himself than to the mother bear. But she raised her head and looked at him. Her eyes were full of understanding, and for a moment their gazes met in a silent agreement. He opened the front door. The cold morning air streamed in, and the sun cast long shadows on the ground. The mother bear stood up and led her cubs to the door. She paused at the threshold and turned to Tom. Her eyes were clear and full of gratitude. It wasn't a wild animal that was looking at him, but a mother who had fought for her children and knew that they had only survived because of his help. The smallest cub, the one that had been so weak upon their arrival, cautiously toddled over to Tom. It raised its small paw and pressed it against his leg, a gesture that deeply touched Tom. The other cubs followed, and each of them seemed to say goodbye in their own way. A short whimper, a hesitant glance. Finally, the mother bear approached. She rose onto her hind legs and gently placed her large paw on Tom's shoulder. It was a moment that took his breath away, an expression of gratitude that transcended any language. Then she turned away and led her cubs out into the clear, cold world. She walked in a line, the cubs close at her side, as they slowly moved toward the forest. Tom stood in the doorway and watched them disappear. The mother bear turned back one last time and raised her paw, a movement that looked like a farewell gesture. The cubs imitated her before they disappeared among the trees. Tom remained standing in the doorway for a long time. The cold crept into his bones, but he felt nothing of it. His gaze remained fixed on the spot where the bears had vanished. In his heart, he knew that this encounter had changed him forever. They had not only shown him their gratitude, but also something he had never understood before: the deep connection between humans and animals. As he finally closed the door, he noticed an imprint in the snow in front of the threshold. It was the mother bear's paw print, clear and distinct, A final greeting. Tom smiled and felt a warm tear roll down his cheek. The world outside might be cold, but in his heart, there was a warmth that would stay with him for a long time. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thanks to our valued viewers, we continue to improve every day. Please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up.